We're spending a lot of time talking about the voice. But the reality is that whether or not there's a voice to Parliament is not the most important issue affecting your life or Australia. So let's start tonight with a serious look at the most important issue we're facing as a nation right now. And it's this: can the RBA and the Labor government get inflation under control without causing a deep recession? Has the narrow path that Philip Lowe has been pursuing of raising rates to tame inflation without crunching the economy, has this narrow path closed? Well, the RBA has this week warned that unemployment will need to rise to 4.5% in the next year to tackle inflation. This means, according to analysis by the Fin Review, 140,000 people losing their jobs in the next year and a half. The RBA says unemployment will need to rise to tackle inflation. And here's RBA Deputy Governor Michelle Bullock making that point on Tuesday.
Our assessment is that for the first time in decades, firms' demand for labour exceeds the amount of labour that people are willing and able to supply. That is, employment is above what we would consider to be consistent with our inflation target. One of the channels through which higher interest rates work to bring down inflation is by reducing the demand for goods and services, and hence overall demand for labour. What this means is that the labour market conditions will invariably soften as inflation is contained. Now, some may hear this and think the Reserve Bank is prioritising its inflation objective ahead of its employment objective. It is true to say we're resolute in returning inflation to target, but this does not mean that employment has taken a back seat.
The Treasurer initially wasn't keen to comment on this dire warning yesterday, but today he did say that rising unemployment was a reality.
I think what the Deputy Governor was referring to was simply reflecting the fact that both the Reserve Bank's forecasts and the Treasury forecasts in the budget expect an uptick in unemployment at the same time as we expect a moderation in inflation. I think her comments really just reflected those forecasts. And we've been pretty upfront, I think, as a government in saying that we expect the economy to slow because of higher interest rates and because of tricky global conditions, and that will have implications for the labour market as well.
It's true that Labor has created more new jobs in its first year than any other government, although this is partly because our population is the largest it's ever been, so relatively speaking, the numbers for everything are larger. And the RBA also points out that even when the jobless rate, or if the jobless rate, reaches 4.5%, this would still be below pre-pandemic levels. However, NAB Chief Alan Oster said that it is inevitable that with a jobless rate of around 1% higher than it is now, and it's now 3.6%, Australia would almost certainly fall into recession. Here he is making that remark to Sky business editor Ross Greenwood last week.
My sort of general measure is that if you get unemployment up 12 or up 1% in the next 12 months, that gets really close to recession. We see unemployment going from 3.5 to 4.6 by the middle of next year. So that's a concern.
And he's not alone. Economists and analysts are concerned about Australia going into a recession. So here's the reality of what we're looking at. Australia's economy and social fabric now has the echo of the 1970s dynamic of a shrinking national pie in per person terms, and conflict over how that pie is shared. The dual trends are economic decline and rising industrial relations conflict. We have deteriorating economic conditions with declining per capita GDP. We've also rising interest rates, 12 consecutively so far, and surely more to come. And people are effectively paying higher taxes because bracket creep is pushing people into higher tax brackets, while inflation means their purchasing power is lower. And as we've just been speaking about, there's rising unemployment. So there is the concern now that we could be about to experience stagflation, This when inflation and stagnation happen at the same time. It's when there's a weak economy, high inflation, and a sharp rise in unemployment. Now, the thing that kicked off stagflation of the 1970s was the OPEC oil crisis, and this led to higher energy prices and petrol prices. We are now seeing similar issues with high petrol and energy costs, partly caused by restrictions on coal and gas output. The World Bank warned about the possibility of stagflation just last year. World Bank President David Malpass said, and I quote, "Even if a global recession is averted, the pain of stagflation could persist for several years unless major supply increases are set in motion." Now, like the 1970s, against this backdrop, there's also more conflict over the shrinking pie. Unions in Australia are feeling emboldened under a Labor government and, well, it seems rightly so. There's increasing conflict over industrial issues, and the gig economy is the modern incarnation of it. Chris Bowen's new National Net Zero Agency is, well, basically a sop to the ACTU. As you can see on your screen, they even issued a press release about it. And Workplace Relations Minister Tony Burke is introducing industrial relations reforms so radical that it's led to business and employer groups forging an alliance to fight it, with a war chest greater even than during the anti-mining tax campaign. While the industrial relation disputes that we are starting to see now are nothing like that of the 70s, the tensions are rising and there's every risk we could end up there. At a time when the RBA boss Philip Lowe is begging Labor to lift productivity in order to offset the inflationary impact of wage rises, this IR reform will have the opposite effect. To be very clear, employers are saying that the same job, same pay reforms make it harder to employ individuals. They say it reduces flexibility in the workplace and thus will impact on productivity. Labor's aggressive renewable energy push too will have an impact because in the interim, it reduces our cheap energy advantage. So it does look like the Labor government is actually embarking on policy initiatives that are slowing productivity growth. And remember, Labor didn't even invite the Productivity Commission to its job summit last year. And further to that, Labor has introduced wage rises for childcare workers of 25%. This too, highly inflationary. Now, we don't have the centralised wage settings and heavy union influence of the 70s, but here is how it's similar. The government now employs more people through the health and education sectors. The government's involved in nurses, NDIS, aged care, and other wages. And this is playing a similar role in ultimately pushing up all wages. It's then replicated by the private sector. Now, the RBA's stated goal is for inflation to return to 2 to 3% from its current level of 6.8%. And this is why Phil Lowe is repeatedly urging the Albanese government to lift productivity to help offset the inflationary impact of wage rises. Lowe points out that productivity has been declining over the past 3 years, and really it has been falling over the past decade. But the question is whether Labor is now doing its part to help bring down inflation. If it's not doing enough to lift productivity, as the RBA has been desperately urging it to, then it leaves the central bank to shoulder most of the responsibility for bringing down inflation. And as you know, the RBA only has one lever to do this: raising interest rates. And it's this that will lead to the estimated 140,000 people losing their jobs, taking the total number of Australians out of work to an estimated 656,000 people, according to analysis in the Fin Review. And it's this that risks pushing us into a deep recession.
My intention is to come to a concluded view on the RBA Governor and announce that in July, but certainly before the Parliament returns. That's always been our intention. The current term of the RBA Governor ends in September, We've said for some time that we'll consider that appointment around the middle of the year. It's now around the middle of the year. I'm in the process of consulting with my cabinet colleagues and with others. This is a big job, and so it's a big call.